Mason Lorne never expected heroism to betray him. Smoke still clung to his shirt when Assistant DA Trevor Hale appeared at his door, polished and precise, carrying questions about a case that should have stayed dead. Phoenix heat pressed against windows like accusation. The boy Mason saved lay fighting for breath 3 miles away, and somewhere in the space between rescue and reckoning, old lies began to crack. Trevor's eyes held something Mason recognized, not gratitude but fear. Subscribe to discover what truth demands when redemption collides with buried evidence, and when saving one life means risking the revelation that could destroy 2. The sedan had been burning for 90 seconds when Mason Lorne first smelled it. He was walking home from the convenience store, a plastic bag swinging from his wrist containing nothing more significant than eggs and instant coffee, the kind of mundane groceries that marked the rhythm of his careful, quiet life. The Phoenix evening stretched wide and amber, heat still radiating from asphalt even as the sun bled into the horizon. And he'd been thinking about nothing in particular. Maybe the Diamondbacks game he'd listen to later. Maybe the rent due in 5 days. When the acrid stench of burning rubber and gasoline cut through the desert air. He stopped mid-stride, the bag going still against his thigh, and turned his head toward 7th Street, where black smoke climbed into the sky like a desperate prayer. His first instinct wasn't heroism but caution. The kind of wariness that ex-convicts carry in their bones, the knowledge that getting involved in anything at all, could spiral into questions, police reports, and the resurrection of a past he'd spent 6 years trying to bury. But then he heard it, a scream, high and thin, the kind that cuts through smoke and distance, and the careful walls people build around their own survival. Mason's legs moved before his mind caught up, the grocery bag dropping to the sidewalk as he broke into a run, his work boots pounding against concrete. The sedan was wrapped in flames by the time he reached it, orange and furious. The driver's side door buckled inward from what must have been a collision with the light pole, now bent at a sickening angle. Through the smoke and heat shimmer, he could see the boy inside, maybe 15 or 16, slumped against the steering wheel, his face obscured by blood and the dark haze filling the car's interior. Mason's hands found the passenger door handle, metal already hot enough to sting his palms, and he yanked hard once, twice, the hinges protesting before giving way. Smoke poured out like something alive, caustic and choking, and he plunged his arm into the inferno, fingers searching for fabric, for skin, for anything he could grip and pull. The boy was heavier than he looked, deadweight and tangled in a seatbelt that Mason had to rip free with both hands, his knuckles scraping against the buckle mechanism as flames licked closer to the back seat. Mason's lungs burned, each breath a negotiation between oxygen and poison, and for one terrible moment he thought he wouldn't make it, that they'd both die here on 7th Street while evening traffic slowed to watch. But then he had the boy under the arms, hauling him backward through the passenger door, stumbling onto the asphalt as the sedan's fuel tank ignited with a low, guttural roar that sent heat rolling over them in waves. Mason dragged the kid another 10 feet, then 20, before collapsing beside him on the curb, coughing so hard his ribs ached, ash and sweat streaking his face in grey rivers. The boy wasn't moving, his chest barely rising, and Mason pressed 2 fingers against the kid's neck, searching for a pulse, his own heart hammering so loud he almost couldn't feel the faint, irregular throb beneath skin slick with blood and smoke residue. People gathered then, emerging from buildings and cars, their faces painted in the orange glow of the burning wreckage, mouths open in shock or forming words Mason couldn't hear over the roar in his ears. Someone was calling 911, a woman's voice high and urgent, and somewhere in the crowd he thought he heard his name, though he couldn't be sure. His hands were shaking, trembling so violently he had to press them flat against his thighs to make them stop. And he realized with a sick lurch that he was crying, Not from the smoke, but from something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the boy or the fire and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming terror of being seen, of being noticed, of becoming a story that people would tell, a man pulled from the shadows of his own careful anonymity into the harsh, unforgiving light of public attention. He'd saved a life, yes, but in doing so he'd made himself visible again, and visibility for men like Mason Lorne was never, ever safe. When the paramedics arrived, they worked with brutal efficiency, loading the boy onto a stretcher while one of them checked Mason over, shining a penlight into his eyes and asking questions he answered on autopilot. Name, age, any chest pain, any trouble breathing. He shook his head to most of it, accepted the oxygen mask they pressed into his hands but didn't use, his gaze fixed on the ambulance as it pulled away, sirens splitting the night. The fire department sprayed foam over what remained of the sedan, reducing the inferno to hissing, blackened metal, and a police officer approached Mason with a notebook, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp, cataloguing every detail of his face. He knew that look, had seen it 1,000 times before. The assessment, the calculation, the silent running of his appearance through some internal database of suspicion. She asked him what he'd seen, and he told her, leaving out the terror, the shaking hands, the way his past had pressed against his chest like a stone the entire time he'd been pulling the boy free. She thanked him, called him a hero with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and he nodded because what else could he do? The crowd began to disperse as the spectacle wound down, people returning to their lives, their dinners, their evening routines, leaving Mason standing alone on the curb, with ash in his lungs and the taste of smoke thick on his tongue. He retrieved his grocery bag from where he'd dropped it, the eggs miraculously unbroken, and started walking again, his legs unsteady, his hands still trembling despite his efforts to control them. Somewhere behind him, the wreckage of the sedan continued to smolder, sending thin trails of smoke into the darkening sky, and Mason Lorne walked faster, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, a certainty that this moment of visibility, of heroism, of being pulled from the careful shadows he'd inhabited for so long, was going to cost him something he couldn't afford to pay. He didn't know yet that the assistant district attorney was already on his way, that Trevor Hale had heard the name Mason Lorne crackle across the police scanner and felt his stomach drop, that the collision between past and present was hurtling toward him faster than any burning car. He only knew that he'd done something good, something right, and that somewhere deep in the architecture of his scarred and careful heart, that terrified him more than anything else possibly could. Trevor Hale's car idled outside Mason Lorne's apartment complex at 11:47 p.m., the dashboard clock glowing green in the darkness, marking time like a countdown Trevor couldn't stop. He'd driven here without deciding to, his hands guiding the steering wheel through familiar Phoenix streets, while his mind churned through implications, consequences, the careful architecture of lies he'd built 8 years ago, now threatening to collapse under the weight of one man's unexpected heroism. The radio murmured softly, some late-night talk show host discussing conspiracy theories, and Trevor reached over to silence it, needing the quiet to think, to plan, to figure out what the hell he was going to say when Mason opened the door. The building before him was a tired 3-story affair, stucco painted the color of sand, exterior lights flickering intermittently, the kind of place where people lived when they were trying to rebuild from nothing. Trevor had reviewed Mason's parole file that afternoon, after the rescue had made the evening news, his fingers scrolling through digital records that painted a picture of a man who'd done everything right. Steady employment, clean drug tests, no violations, no trouble. A model parolee, a man who should have been left alone, but Trevor couldn't leave him alone because Mason's face on the television screen, streaked with ash and caught in profile as paramedics loaded the boy into the ambulance, had triggered something in Trevor's memory. Not the memory of the trial, which he'd tried for years to bury, but the memory of what he'd done afterward. The evidence he'd found 3 days too late, tucked into a case file that should have been disclosed. A witness statement that contradicted the prosecution's timeline, words typed on paper that would have created reasonable doubt if Trevor had been the kind of man who valued truth over conviction rates. He'd buried it, hidden it in a locked drawer in his home office, telling himself it didn't matter, that Mason Lawn was guilty enough of other things, that one conviction more or less wouldn't change the trajectory of a life already committed to crime. Except Mason had changed. The file proved it. 6 years of perfect behavior, and now this act of terrifying visible heroism that had thrust him back into the public eye, back onto Trevor's radar, back into the space where secrets couldn't stay buried anymore. Trevor climbed out of the car, his dress shoes clicking against pavement still warm from the day's heat, and approached the building's entrance, pressing the buzzer for Unit 2B without allowing himself time to reconsider. The intercom crackled, and Mason's voice came through, rough with sleep or smoke damage, asking who was there. Trevor cleared his throat, aware of how absurd this was, how reckless, aware that he should have waited until morning, should have sent a subordinate, should have done anything except show up at midnight like some character from a noir film, driven by guilt he had no right to feel. He identified himself Assistant District Attorney Trevor Hale, and there was a long, weighted silence before the door buzzed open. Trevor climbed the stairs slowly, each step a negotiation with himself, arguments forming and dissolving in his mind. He could ask about the rescue, frame this as follow-up, as concern for a parolee who'd been involved in a traumatic incident. He could leave the past buried, walk away from this still intact, but even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. Knew that something in him had broken the moment he'd seen Mason's face on television, the way the man had looked simultaneously heroic and terrified, like someone who'd done something good and was waiting for punishment. Mason's apartment door was already open when Trevor reached the second floor, light spilling into the hallway, and Mason stood in the threshold, his frame filling the doorway, still wearing the same ash-covered jeans and t-shirt from the rescue. His face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed from smoke or exhaustion or both, and he regarded Trevor with an expression that was impossible to read. Not hostile, not welcoming, just carefully blank, the face of a man who'd learned not to show anything that could be used against him. Trevor stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain, the speech he'd half prepared on the drive over evaporating under Mason's steady gaze. They'd been in the same courtroom 8 years ago, Trevor at the prosecution table, Mason at the defense, but they'd never spoken directly, never acknowledged each other as human beings rather than opposing pieces in the criminal justice system's brutal chess game. Now, standing in this shabby hallway with midnight pressing in from all sides, Trevor felt the full weight of that dehumanization, the way the system allowed, encouraged, people to treat each other as abstractions rather than lives. Mason stepped back, a gesture that might have been invitation or might have been resignation, and Trevor entered the apartment, taking in details with the automatic assessment of a man trained to notice things. The space was sparse but clean, furniture minimal, no photographs on the walls, no personal touches beyond a single bookshelf crammed with paperbacks and a small television playing muted news. It was the apartment of someone who expected to leave at any moment, who hadn't allowed himself to put down roots, to believe in permanence. Mason closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed over his chest, waiting, and Trevor realized the man wasn't going to make this easy, wasn't going to fill the silence with nervous chatter or explanations. He was going to make Trevor say whatever he'd come here to say, and Trevor respected that even as it made his task harder. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally managed, "I heard about what you did tonight, the boy. That That was a brave thing." The words felt inadequate, hollow, and Mason's expression didn't change, though something flickered in his eyes. Not gratitude, but something closer to suspicion, or maybe recognition, that this conversation was about more than heroism. Trevor forged ahead, his voice gaining steadiness as he moved into more familiar territory, the language of law and procedure. He explained that he was there in an unofficial capacity, that parolees involved in high-profile incidents sometimes attracted unwanted attention, that he wanted to make sure Mason understood his rights, his options, how to navigate the media attention that might follow. It was all true, as far as it went, but it was also entirely beside the point, and they both knew it. Mason listened without interrupting, his silence a pressure that filled the room, and when Trevor finally ran out of bureaucratic reassurances, the quiet stretched between them like a chasm. Then Mason spoke, his voice low and rough with smoke damage, asking the only question that mattered. "Why are you really here, Mr. Hale?" And Trevor, standing in that sparse apartment at midnight, surrounded by the evidence of a life carefully rebuilt from ruins he'd helped create, found that he had no answer he was willing to give. Not yet. Not when the truth would require him to dismantle everything he'd built his career on. Every lie he'd told himself about justice and conviction rates and the greater good. So instead he said nothing, and in that silence both men understood that this was only the beginning, that the collision between past and present had finally, irrevocably, begun. Mason didn't sleep after Trevor Hale left. He sat on the edge of his bed in the darkness, listening to the building's nocturnal sounds, pipes groaning, a neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls, the distant wail of sirens that never really stopped in this part of Phoenix. His hands still trembled slightly, the adrenaline from the rescue refusing to fully metabolize, leaving him wired and hollow at the same time. He'd washed the ash from his skin in a scalding shower, watching black water circle the drain, but the smell of smoke clung to everything, embedded in his sheets, his pillow, the very air he breathed. Or maybe that was just memory, the way trauma had a habit of lingering in senses rather than thoughts. He kept seeing the boy's face, pale and slack with unconsciousness, kept feeling the weight of that body in his arms, the terrible responsibility of another person's life, depending on his ability to move, to act, to overcome the paralysis of his own fear. And beneath all of that, threaded through every thought like a poisonous current, was Trevor Hale's midnight visit. The unspoken questions hanging in the air between them, the way the DA's eyes had held something that looked almost like guilt. At 3 a.m, Mason gave up on sleep entirely and retrieved the shoebox from the back of his closet, pushing aside work boots and a winter coat he rarely needed in Arizona's relentless heat. The box was battered cardboard, held together with packing tape yellowed by time, and he hadn't opened it in 2 years. Hadn't allowed himself to look at what it contained, because looking meant remembering, and remembering meant risking the careful emotional equilibrium he'd fought so hard to maintain. But tonight, with smoke in his lungs and Trevor Hale's face imprinted behind his eyelids, he needed to remember, needed to trace back the path that had led him here, to this moment, to this collision between the man he'd been and the man he was trying to become. Inside the box were artifacts of his old life. Photographs, mostly, faces of people he'd once called family, before understanding that gang affiliations were the cruelest parody of kinship. There were letters, too, ones he'd received during his 4 years in prison, words of encouragement from a sister who'd eventually stopped writing, legal documents stamped with case numbers and conviction dates, the paperwork of a life systematically dismantled by the criminal justice system. But what Mason was searching for was at the very bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag and hidden beneath everything else like a shameful secret. He pulled it out carefully, his fingers remembering the shape before his eyes confirmed it. A small notebook, spiral-bound, with a blue cover stained by what might have been coffee or blood, he'd never been sure which. This was his ledger, the record he'd kept during his last year with the Southside Kings, when he'd still been stupid enough to believe that loyalty and documentation were compatible, that writing things down made them real in some way that mattered. The notebook contained names, dates, transactions, the mundane accounting of illegal enterprise rendered in his careful handwriting. But more than that, it contained his testimony about the night everything fell apart, the night that had eventually sent him to prison, the night when he'd witnessed something he'd never been able to fully speak about because the person who could corroborate his story had vanished before the trial began. Marcus Rivera. The name stared up at Mason from a page dated June 14th, 2016, written in ink that had faded to a ghostly grey, but was still legible if you knew what you were looking for. Marcus had been there that night, had seen what Mason saw, had been the second witness to an incident that the prosecution had later spun into a narrative of Mason's guilt. But Marcus had disappeared 3 days before trial, and without his testimony, Mason's defense had crumbled, the jury finding him guilty based on a timeline that didn't quite add up, on evidence that seemed solid until you looked at it closely and realized there were gaps, inconsistencies, moments that didn't make sense unless someone was deliberately obscuring the truth. Mason had tried to tell his public defender about Marcus, about what the man had seen, but the lawyer had been overworked and underpaid, shuffling through a caseload that demanded plea bargains rather than investigations, and Marcus Rivera had remained a ghost, a name without substance, a witness who'd vanished into the cracks of a system that had no time for inconvenient truths. Now, sitting in his darkened apartment with the notebook open on his lap, Mason wondered if Trevor Hale knew about Marcus, if the DA had been involved in that disappearance, or if he'd simply benefited from it, from the way the trial had proceeded smoothly once the problematic witness was gone. The thought made something cold settle in Mason's stomach, a nauseating suspicion that tonight's visit hadn't been about concern for a parolee, but about containment, about making sure that Mason's sudden visibility didn't lead him to start asking questions again, to start looking for answers about what had really happened 8 years ago. Because if Marcus were ever found, if his testimony were ever heard, it would unravel the conviction that had stolen 4 years of Mason's life. It would prove that the timeline was wrong, that Mason had been somewhere else when the crime occurred, that reasonable doubt had existed all along, but had been buried beneath procedural efficiency and a prosecutor's ambition. And Trevor Hale, with his polished shoes and midnight house calls, would be revealed as either complicit or catastrophically negligent, neither option offering much in the way of redemption. Mason closed the notebook and returned it to the shoebox, his movements mechanical, his mind already racing ahead to implications and consequences. The boy he'd saved tonight was fighting for his life in a hospital 3 miles away, and Mason didn't even know the kid's name, didn't know if he had family or friends, or anyone who'd be relieved to learn he'd survived. But somehow, that boy's life had become tangled with Mason's own, the rescue creating a butterfly effect that had brought Trevor Hale to his door and forced open doors in Mason's memory that he'd worked hard to seal shut. He thought about Elena Ruiz, the woman who'd witnessed the rescue, whose face he'd glimpsed in the crowd, her expression a mixture of awe and something else, something that looked like recognition. He didn't know her, had never seen her before, but she'd looked at him like she understood something, like she'd seen past the heroism to the terror underneath. And maybe she had. Maybe some people were just better at reading the truth written in other people's bodies. The way trauma and guilt and desperate hope all manifested in trembling hands and eyes that couldn't quite meet yours. Mason lay back down on the bed. The shoebox returned to its hiding place and stared at the ceiling while dawn began to grey the windows. Redemption, he thought, was supposed to feel like release, like the shedding of old skin and the emergence of something new and clean. But for him, it felt like the opposite, like the tightening of a noose he'd only just noticed had been placed around his neck years ago, and was only now, in the aftermath of heroism, beginning to constrict. Elena Ruiz couldn't stop thinking about Mason Lorne's hands. She'd been 2 cars back when the sedan hit the light pole, had watched the whole thing unfold with a sick, helpless horror, the screech of metal, the sudden eruption of flames, the way other drivers slowed but didn't stop, their faces pale behind windshields as they calculated whether involvement was worth the risk. She'd pulled over immediately, her own hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone to call 911, her voice tight and high when the dispatcher answered, asking for location and details, while Elena's eyes stayed fixed on the burning car and the impossibility of anyone surviving inside it. Then Mason had appeared, running from somewhere off-screen in Elena's mental film of the event, his body moving with a purpose that transcended self-preservation, and she'd watched him wrench open the passenger door, watched him disappear into smoke and flame, watched him emerge, dragging a body that looked already dead. But it was his hands afterward that had stayed with her, the way they'd trembled so violently against his thighs, the way he'd pressed them flat like he was trying to hold something inside himself that desperately wanted out. Elena knew that tremor, knew it in her bones, in the muscle memory of her own body, because she'd felt it herself 7 years ago when her ex-husband had finally left, when the violence she'd endured for 3 years had ended not with legal intervention or family rescue, but with her own desperate flight in the middle of the night. Her son Marco, then just 8 years old, clutched against her chest as she'd run barefoot through their neighborhood to a friend's house. She'd shaken like that for weeks afterward, her hands refusing to steady, her body processing trauma that her mind couldn't yet articulate. Therapists later told her it was a stress response, the nervous system's way of discharging energy that had been trapped during the prolonged threat, but understanding it intellectually didn't make it any less terrifying to experience. So when she'd seen Mason's hands trembling on the curb, seen the way he'd been crying without seeming to notice his own tears, she'd recognized something fundamental, something that transcended the specifics of their different traumas. She'd seen a person holding themselves together through pure will, the way survivors did in the immediate aftermath, before the full weight of what they'd just endured came crashing down. She'd wanted to approach him then, had actually taken a step forward before catching herself, before remembering that she was a stranger, that her presence would be intrusion rather than comfort, that people in shock needed space more than they needed consolation from well-meaning witnesses. So she'd stayed back, had watched him give his statement to the police officer, had seen the way his jaw tightened when the officer smiled and called him a hero. Eleanor knew that expression too, the flinch away from praise, the instinctive rejection of a label that felt simultaneously too large and too simple to capture the complexity of what had just occurred. Heroism, she'd learned in her own journey through trauma and recovery, was rarely clean or simple. It was more often desperate, terrified action taken by people who'd already survived too much, and now found themselves thrust into another impossible situation, where the only choice was between action and the moral injury of standing aside. Mason Lorne had looked like a man who knew both options came with costs he couldn't afford to pay. That night, after returning home and checking on Marco, now 15 and blessedly asleep, headphones on, oblivious to his mother's shaken state, Elena had searched for information about Mason Lorne. It wasn't difficult. The local news was already running the story, complete with Mason's name, his age, and the detail that made her stomach clench: ex-convict. The coverage was superficially positive, framing Mason as a reformed criminal who'd redeemed himself through heroism, but Eleanor could read the subtext, the way the journalist emphasized his past, as though his prison record made the rescue more surprising, more noteworthy. as though people with criminal histories couldn't be expected to run toward fire and danger to save strangers. It infuriated her, that casual dehumanization, the way society couldn't allow someone like Mason to simply be heroic without qualifying it, without reminding everyone that he'd once been something else, something lesser. She'd known men like Mason at the domestic violence shelter where she'd volunteered for the past 5 years, men whose criminal records were often the result of poverty, addiction, or the terrible choices people made when they were young and desperate. Men who were trying, against enormous odds, to rebuild lives that society seemed determined to keep them from reconstructing. She didn't make a conscious decision to find him. It just sort of happened, the way things sometimes did when Elena's protective instincts, honed through single motherhood and her work with vulnerable populations, kicked into gear. She learned which apartment building he lived in through a combination of public records and discreet questions asked to the right people. She told herself she just wanted to check on him, to see if he was okay, to offer something, she wasn't sure what, that might acknowledge what he'd done and what it had cost him. But beneath that, if she was being honest, was something else, something more selfish. She wanted to understand why his trembling hands had affected her so profoundly, why seeing his fear had cracked open something in her own carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. Maybe it was because Marco was exactly the same age as the boy Mason had saved, and Elena couldn't stop imagining what it would mean if someone had run toward fire for her son. How grateful she'd be, how that gratitude would transcend any detail of the rescuer's past. Or maybe it was because she recognized in Mason something she'd spent years trying to cultivate in herself. The courage to act despite fear, despite the voice that screamed to stay safe, to stay invisible, to protect yourself first and always. 3 days after the rescue, Elena stood outside Mason's building at 7 in the evening, a container of homemade pozole in her hands, because she'd been raised to believe that food was the most honest form of care, the most acceptable way to intrude on someone's privacy with good intentions. She buzzed his apartment, her heart beating harder than the situation warranted, and when his voice came through the intercom, wary, questioning, she introduced herself as the woman who'd witnessed the rescue, who'd called 911, who just wanted to thank him properly. There was a long pause, long enough that Elena thought he might refuse, might tell her to go away, might exercise his perfectly reasonable right to privacy. But then the door buzzed open and she climbed the stairs to Unit 2B, the pozole warm against her palms, her mind rehearsing and discarding opening lines. When Mason opened the door, she was struck first by how tired he looked, by the shadows under his eyes that spoke of nights without sleep, and second, by the wariness in his expression, the guarded quality that she recognized from the shelter, from people who'd learned that kindness often came with hidden costs. She smiled, trying to make it genuine rather than pitying, and held out the container like an offering. "I'm Elena," she said simply, "and I think you probably saved my son's future, even if it wasn't my son you pulled from that car." Mason looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his face, some calculation being made, and then he stepped aside to let her in, accepting the pozole with hands that Elena noticed with a pang of recognition were no longer trembling, but were scarred in ways that spoke of harder times than just one rescue from a burning car. The boy had a name, Daniel Cho, 15 years old, sophomore at Central High School, only son of parents who'd immigrated from South Korea before he was born, and who now ran a small grocery store on the east side of Phoenix. Mason learned these details from the news, from following the story with an obsession he couldn't quite explain, refreshing local news websites multiple times a day for updates on Daniel's condition. The boy had been in ICU for 3 days, unconscious from smoke inhalation and head trauma, his status listed as critical but stable, whatever that meant in the careful language of medical euphemism. Mason found himself thinking about Daniel constantly, wondering what the kid had been doing on 7th Street that evening, whether the accident had been just bad luck or something more, texting while driving, alcohol. The thousand ways young people made mistakes that shouldn't cost them their lives, but sometimes did. He wondered if Daniel knew that someone had pulled him from the fire, if consciousness had flickered long enough for him to register being saved, or if the whole thing was just darkness and then waking up confused in a hospital with tubes and monitors and parents whose faces were carved with relief and terror in equal measure. On the 4th day after the rescue, Mason's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Caution was a habit he'd learned in prison and never fully shaken, but something made him pick up. Maybe curiosity, maybe the superstitious belief that ignoring calls only delayed bad news rather than preventing it. The voice on the other end was female, professional, identifying herself as a social worker from Phoenix General Hospital. Mason's stomach dropped. His first thought that Daniel had died, that he was about to hear how his rescue had ultimately failed, how the boy had succumbed to injuries too severe to overcome, despite those crucial minutes of saved time. But the social worker was calling with a different kind of news. Daniel had regained consciousness that morning, and one of the first things he'd done, before even fully understanding where he was or what had happened, was ask about the man who'd saved him. He'd been insistent about it, the social worker explained, worried in a way that seemed to go beyond simple gratitude, asking if the man was okay, if he'd gotten in trouble, if people knew he was a good person. The phrasing had struck the social worker as odd, that last part, and she'd looked into the circumstances of the rescue, which led her to Mason's parole status, which led her to make this call. To ask if Mason might be willing to visit Daniel in the hospital, Mason's first instinct was to refuse. Visiting would mean entering institutional space. A hospital, yes, but still a building full of authority figures, security personnel, people who'd look at him and see ex-convict before they saw anything else. It would mean being visible again, being thanked, being positioned as a hero when he felt anything but heroic, when his hands still shook sometimes in the middle of the night, and he woke gasping from dreams where he couldn't reach the boy in time, where flames consumed them both. But the social worker mentioned that Daniel had been agitated after waking, anxious in ways that the medical staff couldn't fully calm, and that knowing Mason was safe seemed to matter to the boy in a way his parents didn't quite understand. There was something in her voice that suggested she didn't understand it either, but that she'd learned to trust the instincts of trauma survivors, to recognize that healing sometimes required things that didn't make logical sense. So Mason agreed, surprising himself, and 2 hours later found himself walking through the automatic doors of Phoenix General, past the gift shop and the information desk, following directions to the ICU with his heart beating too fast and his mouth dry with a nervousness that felt disproportionate to the situation. Daniel's room was on the 3rd floor, in a wing that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and Mason stood outside the door for a full minute before knocking, steeling himself for what he'd find inside. The social worker had prepared him, extensive burns on Daniel's arms and chest, smoke damage to his lungs, a concussion that would require monitoring, but overall, miraculous survival. Still, nothing quite prepared Mason for the reality of seeing the boy conscious, propped up in bed with bandages wrapped around his torso and an oxygen tube beneath his nose, his face pale but animated, eyes widening when Mason entered. Daniel's parents were there too, standing on either side of the bed like sentinels, and they turned toward Mason with expressions that cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been awe or might have been the careful politeness of people raised never to show strong emotion to strangers. The mother recovered first, bowing slightly and thanking Mason in accented English, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of gratitude that Mason didn't know how to receive. He nodded, mumbled something inadequate about being glad Daniel was okay, and looked at the boy, who was staring at him with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable. The parents excused themselves after a few minutes, tactfully withdrawing to give Mason and Daniel privacy, though Mason suspected the mother at least would hover just outside the door, protective instincts overriding social convention. Daniel waited until they were gone before speaking, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd only removed that morning. "You didn't have to come," the boy said, which was such an odd thing to lead with that Mason almost laughed. He pulled a chair closer to the bed, settling into it carefully, and replied that he'd wanted to make sure Daniel was all right, which was true but also insufficient, failing to capture the compulsion he'd felt, the need to see with his own eyes that the rescue had mattered, that the boy had survived and would continue surviving. Daniel studied him for a moment, then asked, "Are people being okay to you about what you did?" The question caught Mason off guard, its specificity suggesting that Daniel understood something about how society treated ex-convicts who suddenly became visible, who stepped out of the shadows long enough to do something newsworthy. Mason considered lying, considered offering the kind of reassurance adults gave kids, but something in Daniel's eyes, an alertness that seemed older than 15, made him decide on honesty instead. "Mostly," Mason said carefully. "Some people focus more on where I've been than what I did. But that's okay, I'm used to it." Daniel frowned at that, his expression fierce despite the pallor and the medical equipment. "That's not fair," the boy said, with the absolute certainty of someone too young to have learned that fairness was a childhood fantasy that rarely survived contact with reality. "You saved my life. Nothing else should matter." Mason felt something crack open in his chest, some defensive wall he'd maintained for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. He wanted to tell Daniel that the world didn't work that way, that redemption was never complete, that past sins clung to you like smoke, no matter how many heroic acts you performed. But instead, he just nodded, accepting the boy's fierce assertion as a gift he hadn't earned, but would treasure anyway. They talked for another 20 minutes, Daniel asking questions about the rescue, what Mason had seen, what he'd felt, whether he'd been scared, and Mason answering as honestly as he could, leaving out the trembling hands and the tears and the way he'd felt simultaneously terrified and weirdly numb, the way extreme situations sometimes produced a clarity that regular life never offered. When the nurse came to check vitals and Mason stood to leave, Daniel reached out, his bandaged hand hovering in the air between them. "Thank you," the boy said simply, "for not leaving me there." And Mason, walking out of Phoenix General into the late afternoon heat, carried those words with him like a talisman against all the other things people had said and would continue saying about who he was and what his life meant in the careful accounting of society's judgment. Trevor Hale's home office occupied the converted second bedroom of his modest house in a North Phoenix suburb, its walls lined with law books he'd accumulated during 2 decades of legal work, spines alphabetized and color-coordinated in a way that spoke to his need for order, for control, for the illusion that chaos could be managed through proper filing systems. It was in this room, at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night 5 days after the rescue, that Trevor finally unlocked the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk and withdrew the manila folder he'd hidden there 8 years ago. The folder was thin, containing only 3 pages, but its contents represented a moral weight that Trevor had been carrying for so long it had become part of his baseline emotional state. A constant low-level dread that spiked whenever he thought too carefully about the choices he'd made early in his career, when conviction rates had seemed more important than the messier truth of individual justice. The first page was a police report, dated June 17, 2016, 3 days after the incident that had eventually sent Mason Lawn to prison. It detailed an interview with a witness named Marcus Rivera, aged 24, who claimed to have been present during the alleged crime. Rivera's statement contradicted the prosecution's timeline in crucial ways. He placed Mason at a different location at the time of the incident, described events that suggested Mason had been attempting to prevent the crime rather than participate in it, mentioned details about other individuals involved that had never been pursued by investigators who'd already decided Mason was guilty and saw no reason to complicate a straightforward case. The report had been filed by a junior detective, tagged for follow-up and then somehow buried, its existence not disclosed to the defense as Brady material required. Trevor had found it by accident, doing due diligence on a different case, stumbling across Rivera's name in a cross-referenced file and following the thread out of what he'd told himself was thoroughness, but was really the nagging suspicion that the Mason Lawn case had proceeded too smoothly. That 12-hour turnarounds from arrest to conviction rarely happened without someone cutting corners. The second page was Trevor's own handwritten notes from when he'd tried, briefly, to locate Marcus Rivera after finding the police report. Rivera had vanished, not dramatically, not violently, but with the quiet completeness of someone who'd learned that cooperation with law enforcement often carried costs that outweighed any civic duty. Trevor had found an apartment lease terminated early, an employer who said Rivera had stopped showing up for work, a cousin who claimed not to know where Marcus had gone and whose eyes held the kind of wariness that suggested she knew exactly where he was, but understood the wisdom of silence. Trevor had documented these dead ends in his neat, precise handwriting, noting each unsuccessful attempt to find the witness, creating a paper trail that would demonstrate he'd tried, that he'd made an effort even as he knew he wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't pushing hard enough, was allowing himself to be deterred by obstacles that a truly motivated investigator would have overcome. He'd stopped searching after 2 weeks, told himself the witness wasn't credible anyway, that people who ran had reasons to run that usually involved their own guilt or complicity, that the case against Mason Lawn was strong enough without having to account for one contradictory statement from a gang associate who probably had his own agenda. The third page was the one that haunted Trevor most, the one he sometimes woke up thinking about at 3 a.m, his heart pounding with a guilt that had nowhere to go except inward, calcifying into the hard knot of shame he'd learned to live with. It was a copy of the judgment and sentence for Mason's case, the official court record that detailed the conviction, the 4-year sentence, the legal language that transformed a human life into bureaucratic accounting. Trevor had filed this page with the others as a reminder, though a reminder of what he'd never been entirely sure, perhaps of consequences, perhaps of the price other people paid for his ambition, perhaps simply of the moment when he'd made the choice to be the kind of prosecutor who prioritized winning over truth, even though he'd been raised to believe those things should be synonymous. He'd been 37 when he'd made that choice. Young enough to still be building his reputation, old enough to know better. And he'd told himself it was a one-time thing, an aberration, that he'd never again bury evidence or fail to disclose material information. And he'd kept that promise mostly in the 8 years since, had become scrupulous to the point of obsession about following Brady requirements and disclosure rules. But the fact remained that Mason Lawn had served 4 years for a conviction that might not have stood if the jury had heard Marcus Rivera's testimony, and Trevor had allowed that to happen through inaction that felt, in retrospect, indistinguishable from malice. Now, with Mason Lawn suddenly visible again, his face on television and his story in newspapers, Trevor was forced to confront the question he'd been avoiding for 8 years. What was he going to do about the evidence he'd buried? Disclosing it now would be professional suicide. There was no statute of limitations on prosecutorial misconduct, and even if he wasn't criminally liable, his career would be over, his reputation destroyed. Every case he'd ever prosecuted reopened for scrutiny and potential reversal. But keeping it buried, especially now that Mason was in the public eye, felt impossible, the weight of the secret pressing against his chest every time he saw the man's face. Every time he thought about the midnight visit to Mason's apartment and the way they'd stood in that sparse living room, with 8 years of unspoken history between them. Trevor had become a prosecutor because he believed in justice, in the system's capacity to separate truth from lies, guilt from innocence. But he'd learned, over 2 decades of practice, that the system was run by humans, which meant it was inevitably compromised by human weakness, ambition, laziness, confirmation bias, the desire to win that sometimes overcame the obligation to be fair. He'd become one of those compromises, and Mason Lorne's heroism had forced him to acknowledge it in a way he could no longer deflect or rationalize. Trevor slid the folder back into the drawer, locking it again with a key he wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt where it rested against his sternum like a physical manifestation of guilt. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, what choice he was going to make. But he knew the decision couldn't be postponed much longer. Mason was asking questions. Trevor could feel it, even without direct evidence, could sense the shift in the air that came when someone started looking at their own past with new eyes, started wondering if the story they'd been told about why their life went wrong might not be the complete truth. And there was Elena Ruiz, the woman who'd witnessed the rescue, who'd apparently befriended Mason in the days since, who had a reputation as an advocate for people the system had failed, who wouldn't hesitate to start investigating if she suspected there was more to Mason's case than appeared in the public record. Trevor stood and moved to the window, looking out at his quiet suburban street, at houses dark with sleep, at the ordinary landscape of law-abiding citizens who trusted that the justice system worked the way it was supposed to, that prosecutors told the truth and evidence was disclosed, and innocent people didn't go to prison because someone decided winning was more important than getting it right. He thought about his father, a public defender who died when Trevor was in law school, who taught Trevor to revere the law not as a weapon, but as a shield, a protection for the vulnerable against the powerful. His father would have been ashamed of what Trevor had done with Marcus Rivera's statement, ashamed of the ambition that had overridden ethics, ashamed of the son who'd chosen conviction rates over the harder work of pursuing truth wherever it led. Trevor pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window and allowed himself to feel the full weight of that shame, to stop deflecting it or rationalizing it, or telling himself that one buried witness statement didn't matter in the grand scheme of justice. It mattered to Mason Lorne, who'd lost 4 years of his life. It mattered to truth, which existed independent of what was convenient or career-enhancing. And it mattered to Trevor himself, to the kind of person he was, and the kind of person he wanted to be, assuming it wasn't too late to choose differently, to finally do what he should have done 8 years ago and let the consequences fall where they would. The folder in his locked drawer represented evidence that shouldn't exist, not because it was false, but because it should have been disclosed, should have been part of the record, should have given Mason Lorne a fighting chance at a defense that acknowledged the complexity of what had really happened, rather than the simplified narrative the prosecution had presented. And Trevor Hale, standing in his home office at nearly midnight, finally admitted to himself what he'd known all along, that keeping the evidence hidden was no longer about protecting his career, but about protecting himself from the truth of what he'd done and what that made him. The meeting happened in Elena's living room 2 weeks after the rescue, an impromptu gathering that felt simultaneously planned and accidental, the way important moments often do. Mason arrived first, hesitant at the door. still not quite comfortable with Elena's persistent kindness, the way she'd inserted herself into his life with food and conversation, and the assumption that he needed both, which he did even if he couldn't quite admit it. Daniel came next, released from the hospital 3 days earlier, still moving carefully because of his healing burns, but insistent on being present for this, for whatever this was going to be. His parents had been reluctant to let him come, worried about his recovery, but Daniel had exercised the stubborn determination of teenagers who've survived something terrible and now feel entitled to make their own decisions about risk and safety. And then Trevor Hale arrived, unannounced and unexpected, appearing at Elena's door just as Mason was helping Daniel settle onto the couch, and the temperature in the room dropped immediately. Tension crystallizing in the space between the DA and the ex-convict, who both knew they'd been circling each other for 2 weeks, waiting for something to break. Elena, to her credit, didn't ask questions, just gestured Trevor inside and offered coffee with the same easy hospitality she'd extended to everyone else, though her eyes were sharp, watching the dynamics, reading the unspoken history between Mason and Trevor, with the perception of someone trained to recognize power imbalances and hidden trauma. They sat in an awkward configuration in her small living room, Mason and Daniel on the couch, Trevor in an armchair, positioned like he was conducting an interrogation, Elena perched on the edge of another chair, present but letting the men dictate the terms of whatever was about to happen. The silence stretched until Daniel, with the directness of youth that hadn't yet learned to fear confrontation, asked Trevor why he was there. It was a simple question, but it cracked something open, created space for Trevor to either continue hiding or finally speak truth. And after a moment that felt suspended outside normal time, Trevor chose truth. He told them about Marcus Rivera, about the witness statement that had never been disclosed, about his own failure to pursue the lead with the vigor it deserved. He told them about finding the police report and making the choice to bury it, about the ambition and fear that had motivated that choice, about 8 years of carrying guilt that had become part of his daily experience, background radiation he'd learned to live with, until Mason's face appeared on television and made living with it impossible. Trevor's voice was steady as he spoke, not seeking forgiveness or even understanding, just laying out facts in the careful language of law. Though occasionally emotion cracked through, moments where his professional detachment failed and something raw showed itself. Mason listened without interrupting, his body so still it looked carved from stone, only his eyes moving, tracking Trevor's face with an intensity that was almost physical. Elena watched both of them, one hand pressed against her chest like she was holding her heart in place. And Daniel, 15 years old and newly acquainted with how quickly life could end, looked between the adults with an expression that suggested he was learning things about the world that he hadn't been ready to learn, but now couldn't unlearn. When Trevor finished, the silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded his confession, heavier with implication and the weight of decisions that would need to be made. Mason spoke first, his voice rough with emotions he was working hard to control. He asked about Marcus, whether Trevor had any idea where the man might be now, whether there was any chance of finding him 8 years later and getting him to testify about what he'd seen that night. Trevor said he didn't know, that Rivera had vanished thoroughly, that people who went underground in that community tended to stay there unless they had compelling reason to resurface. But he offered something else, something Mason hadn't expected. Trevor would file a motion to vacate the conviction based on newly discovered evidence and prosecutorial misconduct, would admit publicly what he'd done and accept whatever professional consequences followed, would do everything in his power to get Mason's record expunged and his conviction overturned, even if it meant the end of Trevor's career as an assistant DA. The offer hung in the air, too large and too complicated for easy acceptance. freighted with implications about justice and redemption and whether it was possible to undo damage that had been done years ago. Mason asked for time, needed to think, needed to process what Trevor had just offered and what accepting it would mean, not just legally but emotionally. Because overturning the conviction meant revisiting everything, the trial, the testimony, the gang affiliation he'd spent 6 years trying to distance himself from, the person he'd been when he was young and angry and making choices that would echo through decades. It meant reopening wounds he'd worked hard to heal, meant potentially being pulled back into the world he'd fought so hard to leave, meant risking the fragile stability he'd built where people knew him as the guy who worked at the warehouse and minded his own business, not as Mason Lawn, the ex-convict with a complicated past and a prosecutor who'd buried evidence. But it also meant truth, meant the record showing what had really happened, meant the possibility of exoneration rather than just parole, meant maybe finally being able to stop carrying the weight of a conviction that should never have stood. Elena spoke then, her voice gentle but firm, reminding Mason that whatever he decided, he had people who would support him, that he wasn't alone in this the way he'd been alone 8 years ago when the system had chewed him up and spit him out with no one watching to see if the process had been fair. Daniel shifted on the couch beside Mason, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing burns, and said something that surprised everyone in the room. He said that Mason had saved his life by not thinking about consequences, by just acting because someone needed help, and that was enough reason. He said that maybe Mason should think about his own life the same way, should consider what he needed, rather than what was easiest or safest or least complicated. It was naive in the way teenage wisdom often is, not accounting for the complexity of adult life, or the weight of history, or the 1,000 ways that doing the right thing could still lead to pain and loss. But it was also fundamentally true, cutting through all the equivocation and fear to the simple question, did Mason want justice, actual justice, not the performative kind that society offered people like him, but the deeper kind that required truth-telling and accountability, and the willingness to be uncomfortable while things got sorted out. Mason looked at the boy whose life he'd saved, at the burns visible beneath Daniel's t-shirt collar, at the oxygen monitor still clipped to his finger as a precaution, and something in him shifted, loosened. The defensive posture he'd held for so long, finally relaxing into something that might have been acceptance or might have been the first stirring of hope. They talked for 3 more hours, mapping out what would need to happen if Mason decided to pursue overturning the conviction, what evidence still existed, what witnesses might be found, what Trevor would need to disclose and admit publicly. Elena offered to help, said her work with advocacy organizations meant she had contacts who could assist with the investigation, who knew how to find people who didn't want to be found, who understood the community dynamics that might convince someone like Marcus Rivera to resurface and tell his truth. Daniel mostly listened, contributing occasionally, but seeming to understand that his role here was more symbolic than practical, that he represented something important but couldn't actually do much to help beyond lending his presence as a reminder of why any of this mattered, why fighting for justice wasn't just abstract principle, but actual lived stakes where people's futures hung in the balance. And Trevor, for his part, looked simultaneously relieved and terrified. A man who just jumped off a cliff and hadn't yet hit the ground, but knew the impact was coming. Knew that confessing prosecutorial misconduct would destroy the career he'd spent 20 years building, and would mark him permanently as someone who'd failed to uphold the most basic obligation of his office. But he'd made the choice anyway, or maybe the choice had made itself. Had been inevitable from the moment he'd seen Mason's face on television and felt the weight of buried evidence become suddenly, impossibly too heavy to continue carrying alone. When Trevor finally stood to leave, Mason walked him to the door, and they stood there for a moment, two men on opposite sides of the criminal justice system who'd both been shaped and damaged by it in different ways. Trevor extended his hand, an oddly formal gesture given everything that had just been said, and Mason took it, their grip brief but firm, an acknowledgement of something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite animosity either, something more complicated and more honest than either extreme would allow. "Thank you," Mason said, and Trevor shook his head, replied that thanks weren't necessary, that he was just finally doing what he should have done 8 years ago, that redemption, if it existed at all, came from actions rather than words. He left then, walking out into the Phoenix night, where heat still radiated from concrete even at midnight, and Mason stood in Elena's doorway watching him go, feeling something in his chest that might have been relief or might have been grief for the years that had been stolen and couldn't be recovered, no matter how thoroughly the record was corrected. Inside, Elena and Daniel waited, and when Mason returned to the living room, they looked at him expectantly, waiting for him to say what he'd decided, whether he'd pursue the motion to vacate or let things stand as they were. Mason sat back down on the couch, felt Daniel shift beside him in unconscious solidarity, and looked at these two people who'd entered his life through fire and circumstance and chosen to stay, to care, to involve themselves in his complicated history when they had no obligation to do so. He thought about the shoebox in his closet, about the notebook with Marcus Rivera's name written in fading ink, about 4 years in prison and 6 years on parole, and the careful, diminished life he'd built from the wreckage of conviction. He thought about his trembling hands on the curb after the rescue, about the way heroism had felt like exposure rather than triumph, about how exhausting it was to always be watching, always be careful, always be ready for the moment when his past would be used against him. And then he thought about Daniel's words, about acting without thinking about consequences when someone needed help, and about whether he could extend that same grace to himself, could help himself the way he'd helped a stranger trapped in a burning car, could reach into the flames of his own complicated history and pull out something worth saving. "I want to do it," Mason said finally, his voice steady, despite the fear threading through every word. "I want to pursue the motion. I want the truth on the record, whatever it costs." Elena smiled, tears suddenly bright in her eyes, and Daniel nodded like he'd expected nothing less, like heroism was simply what Mason did, whether the fire was literal or metaphorical, and sitting there in Elena's living room at 1 in the morning, surrounded by people who'd chosen to care about him despite every reason society gave them not to. Mason Lawn felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years, not hope exactly, which felt too fragile, too likely to be disappointed, but something more durable, something that might have been the first glimmering of belief that redemption wasn't something you earned through perfect behavior and endless penance, but something you built through truth-telling and community, and the willingness to be seen, fully seen, in all your damage and complexity and desperate, imperfect striving towards something better. The ashes of his old life, it turned out, didn't just tell the truth about what had burned. They also revealed what had survived, what had endured, what had been worth saving all along.